On May 12, 1919, a fire broke out in the shipping department of a chocolate factory complex on Flushing Avenue in Brooklyn. Just after 1 a.m., a factory watchman spotted smoke on the second floor of the shipping department and, tracing it to its source, discovered a fire. The department stored large quantities of cocoa beans and finished chocolate bars in burlap sacks, and it was later thought that spontaneous combustion within these materials caused the fire. The watchman alerted the New York City Fire Department by means of an alarm in the building, and men from a nearby firehouse were on site within minutes. The fire spread to the third floor of the shipping department, which stored raw ingredients including cocoa and butter. Firefighting water washed a mixture of this material and molten chocolate onto Flushing Avenue. The sugar and butter separated from the mixture and formed a crust that blocked the street's storm drains, leading to a flood. The mixture became greasy and slippery as it cooled, which hindered the movements of the firemen. Waverly Avenue was described in a contemporary Standard Union report as being coated in butter and chocolate. A report in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle described an ocean of fudge flooding the street like lava and noted that it was sufficiently deep to float a rowboat for 2 blocks along Flushing Avenue. The flood attracted 1,001 local children, keen to taste the mixture. The police initially made no attempt to stop them, but around an hour after their arrival, truant officers began collecting the children to take them to their schools. The firefighters decided that the shipping department could not be saved and concentrated their efforts on protecting adjoining buildings. They were successful in preventing the fire's spread, and the blaze was all but extinguished by 11 a.m. A team of firefighters afterwards remained on site to pump out water from the building's basement. The New York City street cleaning team, assisted by the sewerage department, removed the chocolate and butter from the nearby streets. The main part of the chocolate plant was not affected, but the shipping department was destroyed in its entirety. The London beer flood was an accident at the Horseshoe Brewery in London on October 17, 1814. It took place when one of the 22-foot-tall wooden vats of fermenting porter burst. The escaping liquid dislodged the valve of another vessel and destroyed several large barrels. Between 128,000 and 323,000 imperial gallons of beer were released in total. The resulting wave of porter destroyed the back wall of the brewery and swept into an area of slum dwellings known as the Street Giles Rookery. 8 people were killed, 5 of them mourners, at the wake being held by an Irish family for a 2-year-old boy. The coroner's inquest returned a verdict that the 8 had lost their lives, casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. The brewery was nearly bankrupted by the event. It avoided collapse after a rebate from HM Excise on the lost beer. The brewing industry gradually stopped using large wooden vats after the accident. The brewery moved in 1921, and the Dominion Theatre is now where the brewery used to stand, and the Horseshoe Brewery went into liquidation in 1961. At around 4:30 in the afternoon of October 17, 1814, George Crick, the storehouse clerk, saw that one of the 700-pound iron bands around a vat had slipped. The 22-foot-tall vessel was filled, to within 4 inches of the top, with 3,555 imperial barrels of 10-month-old porter. As the band slipped off the vats 2 or 3 times a year, Crick was unconcerned. He told his supervisor about the problem, but was told that no harm whatsoever would ensue. Crick was told to write a note to Mr. Young, one of the partners of the brewery, to have it fixed later. An hour after the hoop fell off, Crick was standing on a platform 30 feet from the vat, holding the note to Mr. Young, when the vessel, with no indication, burst. The force of the liquid's release knocked the stopcock from a neighboring vat, which also began discharging its contents. Several hogsheads of porter were destroyed, and their contents added to the flood. Between 128,000 and 323,000 imperial gallons were released. The force of the liquid destroyed the rear wall of the brewery. It was 25 feet high and 2.5 bricks thick. Some of the bricks from the back wall were knocked upwards and fell onto the roofs of the houses in nearby Great Russell Street. A wave of porter some 15 feet high swept into New Street, where it destroyed 2 houses and badly damaged 2 others. In one of the houses, a 4-year-old girl, Hannah Bamfield, was having tea with her mother and another child. The wave of beer swept the mother and the second child into the street, but little Hannah was killed. In the second destroyed house, a wake was being held by an Irish family for a 2-year-old boy. And Seville, the boy's mother, and 4 other mourners, Mary Mulvey and her 3-year-old son, Elizabeth Smith and Catherine Butler, were killed. Eleanor Cooper, a 14-year-old servant of the publican of the Tavistock Arms in Great Russell Street, died when she was buried under the brewery's collapsed wall while washing pots in the pub's yard. Another child, Sarah Bates, was found dead in another house on New Street. The land around the building was low-lying and flat. With insufficient drainage, the beer flowed into cellars, many of which were inhabited, and people were forced to climb on furniture to avoid drowning. All those in the brewery survived, although 3 workmen had to be rescued from the rubble. The superintendent and one of the workers were taken to Middlesex Hospital, along with 3 others. The coroner's inquest was held at the workhouse of the St. Giles Parish on October 19, 1814. George Hodgson, the coroner for Middlesex, oversaw the proceedings. And the details of the victims were read out as: Eleanor Cooper, age 14. Mary Mulvey, age 30. Thomas Murray, age 3, Mary Mulvey's son. Hannah Bamfield, age 4 years 4 months. Sarah Bates, age 3 years 5 months. And Seville, age 60. Elizabeth Smith, age 27. Catherine Butler, age 65. Hodgson took the jurors to the scene of the events, and they viewed the brewery and bodies before evidence was taken from witnesses. The first witness was George Crick, who had seen the event happen in full. His brother was one of the men who had been injured at the brewery. Crick said that hoops on the vats failed 3 or 4 times a year, but without any previous problems. Accounts were also heard from Richard Hawes, the landlord of the Tavistock Arms, whose barmaid had been killed in the accident, and several others. The jury returned a verdict that the 8 had lost their lives casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. As the coroner's inquest reached a verdict of an act of God, the brewery did not have to pay compensation. Nevertheless, the disaster, the lost porter, the damage to the buildings and the replacement of the vat, cost the company £23,000. After a private petition to Parliament, they recovered about £7,250 from HM Excise, saving them from bankruptcy. The Horseshoe Brewery went back into business soon afterwards, but closed in 1921 when they moved their production to the Nine Elms Brewery in Wandsworth, which they had purchased in 1914. At the time of its closure, the site covered 103,000 square feet. The brewery was demolished the following year, and the Dominion Theatre was later built on the site. As a result of the accident, large wooden tanks were phased out across the brewing industry and replaced with lined concrete vessels. The Dublin Whiskey Fire took place on June 18, 1875, in the Liberties area of Dublin. It lasted a single night but killed 13 people and resulted in €6 million worth of damage in whiskey alone. People drank from the 6 inches deep river of whiskey that is said to have flowed as far as the Coombe. None of the fatalities suffered during the fire were due to smoke inhalation, burns, or any other form of direct contact with the fire itself. All of them were attributed to alcohol poisoning from drinking the undiluted whiskey that had been stored in casks. This alcohol was much more potent than whiskey offered at retail in bottles. The fire is believed to have started in Lawrence Malone's bonded storehouse on the corner of Arty Street, where 5,000 hogsheads, or 315,200 US gallons, of whiskey were being stored to a value of £54,000. The exact cause of the fire is unknown, but it is known to have started between 4:35 p.m. when the storehouse was checked, and 8:30 p.m. when the alarm was raised. At 9:30 p.m., the barrels within the storehouse began to explode with heat, sending a stream of whiskey flowing through the doors and windows of the burning building. The stream of whiskey first stretched down Cork Street, turning onto Ardee Street and catching a house on Chambers Street, then continued farther to Mill Street, where it quickly demolished a row of small houses. People living nearby were first alerted to the fire by the sounds of squealing pigs from nearby livestock pens that had caught fire, and this is said to have contributed to a surprisingly rapid evacuation that was later commended by members of the emergency services, as well as the Lord Mayor of Dublin at the time, Peter Paul McSwiney. He is quoted as saying, "The time given for escape in some places during the progress of the fire was so short, I was apprehensive that some people should be left in danger in the garrets and cellars of the district. But on inquiry, I was happy to learn that no life was lost during the great conflagration." During the evacuation, many people gathered by the streams of whiskey, filling any vessel at hand with the substance. Caps, porringers, and other vessels were all gathered to lap up the burning liquid, resulting in 24 hospitalizations due to alcohol poisoning and 13 subsequent fatalities. The Great Molasses Flood, also known as the Boston Molasses Disaster, occurred on January 15, 1919, in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. A large storage tank filled with 2.3 million U.S. gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 13,000 short tons burst. And the resultant wave of molasses rushed through the streets at an estimated speed of 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring 150 more. The event entered local folklore, and residents claimed for decades afterwards that the area still smelled of molasses on hot summer days. Molasses can be fermented to produce ethanol, which is the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages and a key component in munitions. The disaster occurred at the Purity Distilling Company facility at 529 Commercial Street near Keeney Square. A considerable amount of molasses had been stored there by the company, which used the Harborside Commercial Street tank to offload molasses from ships and store it for later transfer by pipeline to the Purity ethanol plant, situated between Willow Street and Everteesway in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The molasses tank stood 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, and contained as much as 2.3 million U.S. gallons. On January 15, 1919, temperatures in Boston had risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, climbing rapidly from the frigid temperatures of the preceding days. The previous day, a ship had delivered a fresh load of molasses, which had been warmed to reduce its viscosity for transfer. Possibly due to the thermal expansion of the older, colder molasses already inside the tank, or just bad luck, that caused the tank to burst open and collapse. At approximately 12:30 p.m., witnesses reported that they felt the ground shake and heard a roar as it collapsed. A long rumble similar to the passing of an elevated train. Others reported a tremendous crashing, a deep growling, a thunderclap-like bang, and a sound like a machine gun as the rivets shot out of the tank. The density of molasses is about 12 pounds per U.S. gallon, 40% more dense than water, resulting in the molasses having a great deal of potential energy. The collapse transformed this energy into a wave of molasses 25 feet high at its peak and moving at 35 miles per hour. Stephen Puleo describes how nearby buildings were swept off their foundations and crushed. Several blocks were flooded to a depth of 2 to 3 feet of molasses. The molasses was waist deep and covered the street. It swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form, whether it was animal or human being, it was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. A truck was picked up and hurled into the Boston harbor. After the initial wave, the molasses became viscous, exacerbated by the cold temperatures, trapping those caught in the wave and making it even more difficult to rescue them. About 150 people were injured, and 21 people and several horses were killed. Some were crushed and drowned by the molasses, or by the debris that it carried within. The wounded included people, horses, and dogs. Coughing fits became one of the most common ailments after the initial blast. Edwards Park wrote of one child's experience in a 1983 article for Smithsonian. Anthony DeStasio was walking homeward with his sisters from the Michelangelo School and was picked up by the wave, tumbling on its crest, almost as though he were surfing. Then he grounded, and the molasses rolled him like a pebble as the wave diminished. He heard his mother call his name and couldn't answer, as his throat was so clogged with the smothering goo. He passed out, then opened his eyes to find 3 of his 4 sisters staring at him. First to the scene were 116 cadets under the direction of Lieutenant Commander Copeland from USS Nantucket, a training ship of the Massachusetts Nautical School that was docked nearby at the playground pier. The cadets ran several blocks toward the accident and entered into the knee-deep flood of molasses to pull out the survivors, while others worked to keep curious onlookers from getting in the way of the rescuers. The Boston Police, Red Cross, Army, and Navy personnel soon arrived. Some nurses from the Red Cross dived into the molasses, while others tended to the injured, keeping them warm and feeding the exhausted workers. Many of these people worked through the night, and there were so many injured that doctors and surgeons set up a makeshift hospital in a nearby building. Rescuers found it difficult to make their way through the syrup to help the victims, and 4 days elapsed before they stopped searching. Many of the dead were so glazed over in molasses that they were hard to recognize. Other victims were swept into Boston Harbor and were found 3 to 4 months after the disaster. In the wake of the accident, 119 residents brought a class-action lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which had bought Purity Distilling in 1917. It was one of the first class-action suits in Massachusetts and is considered a milestone in paving the way for modern corporate regulation. The company claimed that the tank had been blown up by anarchists. A court-appointed auditor found them responsible after 3 years of hearings, and the company ultimately paid out $628,000 in damages. Relatives of those killed reportedly received around $7,000 per victim. Cleanup crews used salt water from a fireboat to wash away the molasses and sand to absorb it. The harbor was brown with molasses until summer. The cleanup in the immediate area took weeks, with several hundred people contributing to the effort. Yet it took longer to clean the rest of Greater Boston and its suburbs. Rescue workers, cleanup crews, and sightseers had tracked molasses through the streets and spread it to subway platforms, to the seats inside trains and streetcars, to payphone handsets, into homes, and to countless other places. It was reported that everything that a Bostonian touched was sticky.